Hello, Braz. How's it going? Man, this has been going on for a while. I will give kind of a disclaimer that this isn't going to be in any way definitive. I think such a work as this would take probably months to flesh out fully and to develop fully a sort of all-comprehensive theory. But uh, I'm a lazy fellow when I don't have something to do, and this gives me a sort of, I guess, early book report sort of structure to things. I can give you insights into researches as we move along until we get a fuller synthesis. As we scour JSTOR, as they say, for various hot takes on Republican institutions and various other things. I think I posted. Wait a minute, I gotta find something. We won't get. I'll wait a minute to get properly into things. I'm gonna. I'm gonna treat my Discord as a bit of a library. I need to find a thing I posted a while ago. It was kind of polemical. Give me a minute, bro. Where did I put it? What are they doing? You know that I don't know if I rediscovered the JSTOR article that was relevant in the whatever you would call that polemic from. Was that 2021? The whole Carlsbad thing, the JSTOR excerpts, the long knife enjoyer thing. I might have found that same article, of which I am a little bit proud. I am pretty good at scouring JSTOR. I'll bring that up in a minute, but I guess if I want to begin for you, dear fellows, I will say there is a great deal of disagreement as to the demographics of France around the time of the revolution. You'll find all kinds of different claims, and of course, the reason for that is the relative incompleteness of record keeping. It's not being obviously yet a modernized state, it being in the process of achieving that. One would obviously expect great disparities. Oftentimes, classes would be measured in terms of family count rather than an actual head count. But one of the aspects that first struck out to me in this whole thing is there's the whole polemic about nobility, about the justifications for nobility and heredity. And one of the most interesting aspects of France at the time is how thoroughly non-Frankish the ruling class was. And this is something I thought was exaggerated when I first read about it. But I haven't really found anything to the contrary. I found one historian and one PhD dissertation, as well as the sort of Wikipedian knowledge of Will Durant, pointing to the French nobility of the time being about 95% post 15th century, as in only about 5% of the French nobility, according to a good few fellows, were of actually pre-15th century, Frankish or whatever other sort of stock. And that reminded me of the Spenglerian bit about the race of Livy and how it completely died out a few generations after his works. How all of the families, all the great, well-remembered noble Roman names were completely blotted out from history, not by any kind of force at all, but simply by infertility. And that's a good question, of course, one that's constantly bandied around, kind of beaten to death, is why it is that races simply disappear from history. And of course, in this case, it's to refer to a specific class, to a founding stock that gave its name and form to a nation. Very, very rarely would you see an actual racial type disappearing in that manner, but of remarkable human types, of remarkable founding stocks, the default course seems to be infertility after a set few centuries. And of course, nobody can really give an answer to that at the moment, I don't think. But one can always propose theories, one can always have ideas. And in the case of Europe, one reason for that might be simply the small proportional size of the nobility from the beginning. That might be one reason. To give an example, France is about in Y-DNA about 15 to 20% Germanic, and that would have come entirely, or northern France, sorry, and that would have come entirely from Frankish conquerors, and yet that conquering race by the time of the French Revolution would have been, what would that be? They were 5% of 1% of the population. So, 0.05% of the population would have been of that Frankish noble stock, even though the Frankish blood itself would have accounted for, as I said, 15 to 20% of all Y-DNA in the North. So very remarkable. I think a good comparison would be with Japan. Famously, sort of like Spain and Poland, they had about 10% of the population noble in their own medieval period. And remarkably, 10% of the population in total was descended from or at least carried the same subclade of Y haplogroup D as the imperial family. And so that sort of illustrates a greater fertility. The entire population seems to be suffused from above, as in the Frankish case, but it doesn't seem to accompany a total infertility. It doesn't seem to accompany sort of sterilization in the Japanese case. So one can theorize about that. Maybe the greater acceptance early on, the Germanic conquerors tolerated that, but later it would, of course, become less and less common until the Enlightenment, where you just have mistresses and accompanying, of course, less fertile sex in general, even if more of it is being had. Maybe a decline in concubinage, for one thing. The Japanese might have just simply started out with a larger nobility owing to the circumstances of its founding. Maybe there was just more of a demand for that armed soldiery during the collapse of its empire. You can theorize in various ways, but it does seem to be a sort of correlation between the health of that portion of the population, its capacity to pass on its legacy and its spirit, which of course you see in Japan with its modernization, with the rise of its own bourgeoisie, and with the imperial ideology. You did not see a decay in culture. You did not see any loss of national spirit. Of course, you couldn't say that France lost any national spirit in the revolution, but it certainly did have negative side effects, which are not at all present in Japan. So, and Japan brought along its nobility rather than stigmatizing it. So maybe you could say there's just simply less of a dualism between it and the rest of the population. Internally in Europe, a good example might be Germany, to compare with France. It was about 2% noble. France was about 0.5 to 1.5% varyingly. By the way, that's a 41% decrease in the 18th century, which is horrifying. But anyway, in Germany, a larger percentage of that nobility was of the older stock. It did perpetuate itself far more easily. And as satirized by Goethe in that one play of his during the French Revolution, it would be totally ridiculous to apply the sort of class hatred festering in France to Germany. There just simply was not such a division, such antagonism between the classes. They did dutifully perform the roles. The nobility was capable, far more so in military, economic, political service. It did actually justify its upkeep to a greater degree within the given circumstances. There was just simply no particular hatred through the entire country until the influence of the French Revolution directly. So you might give the example of England, I guess. There, as kind of an extreme on the other end, its nobility being an even smaller sliver of the population, but the gentry being opened to full ennoblement being about 5% of the population. So it's a kind of a mixed bag in England. But I thought that was particularly interesting. I think that might be simply the fact of Germany's entering into Western civilization later. Maybe it just simply preserved itself better. Maybe it's just the different character of the German people racially on a deeper level. We could theorize variously as to why that is. Frederick II implementing hereditary Junker status that didn't have any sort of great anti-meritocratic effect on German military performance. They did just fine with that. Otto von Bismarck's family was almost indistinguishable from the wealthier peasants around them. So as I'm trying to illustrate here for you, in Germany and in England, there just were not those sort of bitter class antagonisms. It really is a uniquely French situation. It's very particular, and but I don't think that kind of disparity, the simple fact of a rising bourgeoisie and of a reluctant aristocracy and of an absolute monarchy which can no longer maintain itself, these as being three disparate forces, and then you could give a fourth in the form of the proletariat. But I don't think that sort of disparity between population and its government is sufficient to explain the revolution, because around 1774 to 76, Louis almost set his country on a perfectly fine path. He almost reformed it with very little resistance, under the guidance of his finance minister, Turgot. He almost solved all the problems, almost nipped them all in the bud in the form of bourgeois national assemblies. He overrode Parliament. He simply forced them to sign his decrees, simply using the inertia of his own ancestors and their power over the Parliament. He was able to force through reforms, the abolishment of the corvée, the reformation of taxes, that sort of thing. He had no problem with that because he had that inertia and because he took a firm stand. But upon wavering, upon replacing Turgot with Necker, and upon yielding to pressure from the aristocracy and from his wife, which is cucked, he undid all of that. And of course, those reforms were primary objectives of the early revolution. Those were primary complaints of the representatives, of the delegates. And all of that could have been easily nipped in the bud 2 years into his reign, almost immediately. It was completely the result of his own indecision. It was simple incompetence, as Spengler says in which one was it? Was it Man of Technics? No, I think it was Hour of Decision. He said, "You can't explain the revolution except by a simple erosion of state authority." And of course, the direct parallel of that I gave at the beginning would be the simple disappearance of that old noble stock. It really is just a suicide. It really is just an abnegation, a refusal to assert authority, or refusal for decision. Louis wavered in between wholesome and capped advisors like Turgot and Cologne and Necker. He kept wavering between them. Each of their proposals were fine. They were all for reform. But his constant back and forth, his indecision, was far more devastating than any particular policy pursuit. And what's unique to France is the simple fact of that anarchy. Unlike any other nation in Europe, there was such an overlap of the prerogatives and of the capabilities of the different classes and of different administrations, of different levels of administration, such that Parliament could try to veto the king by simply refusing to register his decrees, even though that should not be within their powers. That the role of Parliament is to register decrees the king makes. It's not to vote on the decree to pass it, but simply to register it, just to enter it into the records. But by refusing to do so, by simply refusing to enter any royal decree into the records, they could in effect veto the king. And Louis simply refusing to overrule them, and succumbing to the pressure of the nobility and later on of the people as well, is really the only reason he failed. So that was the first case of this, was under Turgot in 76, and then again under Cologne in 87, just prior to the National Assembly. You have, again, another example of the suicide of the aristocracy, the complete unforcedness of this entire thing, the complete non-necessity of it. The fact that the nobility of the sword joined with that of the robe and what was the other name of it? Darn it! The bourgeois camp, the majority of the nobility, the mere landholders, the manorial nobility, they joined forces with one another simply to oppose the enactments of the king, in opposition as reactively to Bourbon absolutism, even though it was in no wise in their interests. Each class thought that the Estates General would go in their favor. They thought the lower nobility thought they would be able to outvote the Third Estate. And so they joined forces with the libtard reformers among them, simply as a reaction against royal power, even though, of course, their own well-being was entirely allied with the royal power. And they employed libtard rhetoric all the way through, appealing to the liberty of the Frenchmen. The proles in the street joined in the protests of the nobility of the sword. In Rennes, in Brittany, they referred to the universal rights of man, the fundamental equality of man. It almost seemed like a quotation of the Declaration of Independence. And this was from the Parliament. This was the Parlement of Brittany, not the, so a substantially noble institution. So, as I said, it was essentially an orgy of suicide. It was all completely unnecessary, really from beginning to end. And that's one polemic. That's polemic number one. So as I said, I can't give a complete analysis on the entire French Revolution. That would take months of reading, and I apologize for that. So maybe I'll just break this down into various polemics as they occur to me. What I mentioned earlier about internal chaos, you might put that on a more fundamental level to the racial character of the French, if you like. The disparity of France has always been greater than the rest of Europe. In the north, common law; in the south, Roman law. The various classes at arms with one another. I think the greatest peasant rebellion in Europe in the Middle Ages, the first substantial one, was in northern France, the Jacquerie. It's always been a land of relative disorder, generally speaking. There's always been a sort of disparity of its component parts. But even under the reign of Turgot, for instance, the hired bands of proles went through the country, like throwing grain silos into the river, burning grain silos and throwing grain deposits into the river. I mean, there was like outright class war between the proles and peasants, and almost no royal authority to prevent it, simply reacting later on with a lowering of the price of bread. They finally put the state into order again. But all this seems as a comedy, as I've been implying, compared with the reign of Napoleon, wherein class cooperation provided greater prosperity than any given reform. I mean, authority from above is the one aspect that's lacking through all of this. As I said, no class particularly benefited from the disorder that was being perpetuated. Turgot was kind of a conspiratard. He thought the burn down a factory, or not millions, but he did of the inventor of a new form of wallpaper, kind of a conspiratard idea, but that's kind of illustrated with the proles running through the country. Are they stealing grain? They're just burning grain silos. It does seem to be dark forces at work in the background, of which we're not entirely accounted for. What are my other polemics? Earlier today, I posted that wholesome excerpt from Napoleon Bonaparte on Rousseau. And so the one common theme you'll find in intellectual historiography of the French Revolution is a supposed dichotomy between Rousseau and Voltaire, which I think is quite interesting. It is explicit. Marat made a contrast between himself and his fellows as disciples of Rousseau as against the bourgeois of Voltaire. I think that's an interesting idea, but I don't think it's entirely valid to do it dichotomy in that regard. That's a common theme of Durant, reducing almost every political dichotomy to that of Voltaire and Rousseau. But I think that's kind of gay. Give me a second. I need to explain. Okay, so one aspect of Voltaire that is commonly overlooked is that towards the end of his life, he substantially mellowed out and became a libtard. This isn't very often talked about, but he predicted a revolution in France unless it reformed along the English model. He praised the English form as being semi-democratic, far and above that of France. He published a pamphlet that was openly democratic in sentiment, although he later disowned it. But of course, he did that with almost everything. controversial he ever published. So I don't think very much stock can be placed in that. Obviously, Rousseau was famously somewhat democratic, but even in his case, he admired the limited democracy of Geneva. Really, the two men are both fully bourgeois. Their ideologies are both substantially bourgeois. Both, all ideologues, all philosophers at the time were fully permeated with the idea of natural right, natural inalienable human rights. There wasn't really a great dichotomy there. And I think you might draw a certain line, certainly between the higher and the lower bourgeoisie. You might say the better minds of France were more drawn to Voltaire. The more polemical and gay minds were more drawn to Rousseau. That is generally true. The denunciations of atheism as aristocratic by Robespierre, that sort of thing. That's fair, I think. Napoleon disowning Rousseau from age 16 to... What are other good examples of that? Voltaire, you could say the very notion of the constitutional monarchy was more inspired by Voltaire than any other polemicist of the time when he threw his weight behind it. He was even fonder, you might say, of Louis XVI than of Frederick II. I mean, this idea of Voltaire way overblown, yet by the end of his life, important disclaimer, by the end of his life, he had more fond things to say of Louis XVI, weak, pudgy Louis XVI, than he did for his own loving Frederick II. So that is definitely an overblown dichotomy, an overblown polemic. But if we are going to make a distinction, that is fair. And it is fair to say that it was relevant to the politics of the time. Just as you would say, the entire French Revolution occurred essentially within the bourgeoisie, but that you can divide it between the higher and the lower elements therein. Robespierre cut wages massively towards the end of his reign. He prohibited unions, he prohibited striking. There were plenty of turnings of the back on the proletariat by him and his associates throughout. Maybe he tries to justify disparities of wealth as a result of differing human natures and as a necessary evil that simply has to be borne with and accepted. There's no real explicit communism, except in aspects of the 93 Constitution and in Fouché's shenanigans in Lyon I think that was 93. Yeah, Fouché's various shenanigans in Lyon. Everybody was LARPing as a communist. The rhetoric was very heavily communistic. Universal subsistence was kind of guaranteed by the Constitution of 93. It was never implemented, of course, because they were at war. Fouché was sent down to Lyon during the uprisings and tasked. Well, it's kind of a funny meme. For you, a little red pill. Robespierre first sent Couthon, nice old Couthon, who everybody loved, down to Lyon with instructions, raving, foam at the mouth sort of instructions to destroy every rich house, because Lyon had, of course, risen up during the Federalist uprisings as bourgeoisie had overthrown the loyalists there. And so that made Robespierre very angry, and he wanted every single rich man's house destroyed. Couthon destroyed one house and then left because he didn't want to do anything else. And then they sent Fouché down there, and Fouché made quick work of it, and he was a raving communist, basically. But other than those exceptions, when it came down to it, when actual government policy had to be decided, it is fair to say that there was no active full element really independently, but that as a moral aspect did prevail. I had an argument a while ago with a friend as to whether the revolution can be called substantially nationalistic. That would be another polemic. I think that would be... there are many ways to divide that. Obviously, the vast majority of the French partook of the revolution and joined the war because for nationalistic reasons. As every human population in all of history, obviously that is the case. During the throughout the entire course of it, the cry "Viva la Nación" was, of course, primary. That was the first cry you would hear in any given riot, protest. "Viva la Nación" is one of the first phrases you would hear. Um, Everything was subordinated to the nation, arguably simply as a denial of class, as a denial of. I believe it was Desmoulins who said the aristocracy were essentially foreign. He sort of played the Frankish polemic. Something similar was said by Saint-Just. He said that this is a foreign body amidst us. So that feeling of the foreignness of the aristocracy was played upon, was very important. I wouldn't deny that in any way. But I think it is important to get intellectual origins down here, bro, because even in the case of CAS, wholesome, conservative Republican, he's a bit of a libtard early on, but he's a conservative reactionary Republican. He can kind of hail that. Even in his pamphlet, what was the quote? What was it? Damn it. Okay, anyway. What is the nation? Where is this quote? Damn it, I'm sorry. Anyway, in the case of CAS, he calls the nation an assembly of free individuals. Basically, there's no sort of deeper historiography there. That sort of notion would have to come with romantic nationalism in the 19th century. Obviously, maybe that's a bit redundant. Maybe that doesn't really need to be said. But even in the case of our wholesome conservative Republicans like CAS, there is this sort of natural law libtard idea that a nation is nothing more in essence than an assemblage of individuals with a common law, and that is the its fundamental basis. In regards to the various constitutions of France, constantly changing, in both 89 and 91, and as well 93 in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the nation is only mentioned in one clause, respectively, in each. Its purpose is as a guarantor of sovereignty, and nothing much else is said. The vast majority of rhetoric is dedicated towards the communistic moral fagging, and not much else. So, the idea that this was a national uprising, that doesn't really even need to be said. It's obviously true for the vast majority of the population. It's obviously true for the passions that were being played upon and for very much of the rhetoric, but intellectually it's not true. Robespierre's submission for the Constitution of 93 explicitly mentioned the brotherhood of all men and that no war can be conducted against one's brothers to one's own benefit. And even though that submission, his particular submission, was refused, you can see in the behavior, obviously, the freeing of the slaves, the delegation of all nations, where they had people like dressed up in turbans and stuff. Obviously, the universal humanism, the brotherhood of mankind, the liberation of slaves, these things do add up. And very clearly, the intellectual foundations of the revolution were retarded. You can't, wiggle your way out of that one. It's fundamental to everything. But what could only possibly justify it is, of course, the liberation of those national passions which had been suppressed. That is the positive form which was liberated in the course of the revolution. Which brings me to another polemic. This is the Spenglerian polemic of the national revolutionary as a type, for which he only gives two examples, sadly, namely Cromwell and Mirabeau. But I think you see this. When you read about the French Revolution, you look desperately. You're desperate. You're saddened. You are thrown into disarray. You wish you had a protagonist here. But on the left, you have libtards. On the right, you have a sort of dispassionate, suicidal, and even libtarded aristocracy. And you really feel like you have nowhere to go. So you desperately look for individual exceptions. And I would say you can occasionally find them in such men as Mirabeau, Sieyès, and Carnot. I personally have a soft spot for Carnot as like the one substantial, continual representative of the military voice and of military instincts through everything, to the point of being, even though he was like the right-wing member of the Committee for Public Safety. He was like the right-wing fellow there, the technocrat. He was way further off into terror with regard to the Vendée. He wanted to totally exterminate the Vendée. He's the military standpoint, and he's the fellow you can most easily sympathize with. He shouldered a musket at the Battle of Montigny, I think, in the front lines. So that's very cool. And we like Carnot, kind of. He openly hated Robespierre and Saint-Just. I know some of you like Saint-Just. I don't really know why, but we'll get to that in a bit, I guess. Carnot, the technocrat, he cared more about his nation than anything, to the point where when Napoleon abdicated, Carnot left because he didn't want to see his country fall to libtards like Fouché and Talleyrand. Even though he hated the empire, and even though he left it behind and fled from the service of his country when it was ruled by the emperor, he did come back to it in its hour of need out of a pure patriotic love, and he wept when the emperor abdicated because he knew it was going to be passed on to libtards. So we can admire that wholeheartedly. As to Mirabeau earlier on was much more retarded in handling the riots in Provence. He threatened the property classes with a general strike. He sort of idealized the working classes, the basis and essentially the content of society. I believe at this time he believed in universal male suffrage as well. But suffice to say, practically speaking, he was a man of all sorts of words. I think he was one of very few voices to oppose CAS in openly defying the king when they first formed the National Assembly illegally. Mirabeau was actually one of the voices of moderation in that case, where you would think he'd be a firebrand. He did seem to be polemically flexible. He did kind of go wherever he so wished, wherever was beneficial to him, but with a higher mind towards the welfare of the nation. He was no Talleyrand. He actually hated Talleyrand for his sort of apolitical spirit. Mirabeau did have a longer-term vision in mind. He did simply want to turn France into an England, basically a nation organized along English lines, and for that end, he was willing to appeal fully both to the left and the right. And it sort of fell out of his hands. And while we can sort of blame him for fanning the flames, we can't really hold him too much to account, because he did do everything in his power in the end to maintain moderation, which was his goal from the very beginning. He did try to keep those he left behind in death by binding oaths to see his vision through, but of course that was not ever true. CAS is kind of, in a sense, the most keyed for actively repudiating his former ideas, for going into hiding. Of course, his famous quote is, "I existed," or "I lived, I was." When asked what he was doing during the Reign of Terror, he fled because he saw everything was going to hell. And he, like Mirabeau, supported the crown. Of course, Carnot voted for the death of the king. But in any case, none of these men were of the mountain, properly speaking. But at any rate, CAS, of course, cooperated with Napoleon and Brumaire and ousted his fellow directors, and saw to it that Napoleon became first consul of France. So we hail him for that. We definitely hail him for that. We hail him for his really over-the-top, goofy Masonic constitution. We hail him for limiting a nation of 24 million to effectively 3 million enfranchised Frenchmen. That was deep. So we definitely hail that. And that sort of melts into the other polemic of the right versus the left. Do the left and right exist? People like to be big brain, they like to be high-minded, and they like to deny any genuine polarity between the right and the left of the French Revolution. But I will say I'm really not seeing it, because Carnot, on almost every issue, was to the right of his colleagues within the Committee of Public Safety. Mirabeau and CAS were on the right, obviously, in favoring the monarchy. I can't really think of an exceptional non-communistic individual who held some sort of high-minded fusionism, some sort of based Jacobinism or whatever, I don't really see it. It's not really present. You know, I guess I could get into the other side. I could talk about the left now and demonstrate. Whoop. No, I think I'm actually good. I don't know. Is my mic okay? And oh, it says I have two. Oh, I'll disconnect that one. Okay. I don't know if that improves anything. I hope that improves it. At any rate, what was I saying? Oh yeah. So I don't know if this is an old polemic or if anyone cares about this. I had a kind of a long argument with with my Giesian friends, my two med friends, about this, about the sort of theoretical based Jacobin and why I don't think that really exists. Okay, I'm sorry. Did I apologize if I had horrible audio that whole while. My bad. At any rate, I don't know if anybody still unironically believes in this polemic. I won't particularly comment on its utility or non-utility. I guess it is kind of cool to own the conservatives or whatever. But if we're going to take things physiologically here, I think a good way is to analyze the sort of Winthropian exit of these men, the final account they gave of themselves in death, as well as their own writings, and to simply see what picture they envisioned for the future. I think it's very useful to imagine the horror, the screaming, and the crying of Hébert, of Robespierre, and of Desmoulins as they totally failed to mount the scaffold with any amount of courage, as against the sort of throppy Roman suicide of the Girondins in the fields of Provence, mass Roman suicide. That was very cool. It's very stoic. And of course, Chamfort being the most famous example of that, the moderate Republican who put the bullet to his own head and sort of lay there incapacitated for a year after trying. Maybe you should read Wikipedia on that. It's a very cool account, but he tried very hard to kill himself. Poor Chamfort, but he failed. At any rate, he's another example of that. You look at these people physiologically, the Loebian polemic is completely true. I hail Loeb. Loeb is correct. You look at these people. Carnot he's from Burgundy. Carnot looks like a Burgundian. Okay. He's a pretty good physiognomy. He might as well be German. Looks pretty good. Same thing goes for CAS. Mirabeau a little bit less so, but you can kind of analyze these people from a Loebian perspective, and you do get a very nice sort of correlation there. You do get a nicer physiological picture from the men of the supposed right. But anyway, as far as writings go, as far as the ideological precepts, I already gave you the example of Robespierre. I don't think anyone unironically hails Robespierre. I mean, like I said, Constitution 93, Universal Brotherhood of Men. That's cringe. But one thing that's mentioned is the supposed Spartan beliefs of Saint-Just, that he wanted an epic keyed Spartan state out of France. But you actually read what he wrote on the topic. It's a gynocratic, geriatric sort of communism, peasant communism, universal peasant communism. The youths are to be kidnapped and raised by old men, and they're supposed to be farmers, and this is keyed somehow. But if you compare this with Napoleon's own picture, even when Napoleon was mired in the romanticism of the period, he submitted an essay. So this is a perfect comparison, right? Saint-Just utopia. Everybody's a farmer, everybody's poor, but they're also trained for the army, and they only eat vegetables as well. There's no meat. They eat vegetables. But if you read Napoleon's essay on the topic, it's very keyed. He explicitly sides with Thrasymachus. He literally says, virtue consists in courage and strength. Energy is the life of the soul. The strong man is good. Only the weak man is bad. That was an essay Napoleon wrote for some university somewhere. And he got rejected because it was childish, they said. They said it was childish. These people who lauded Rousseau and gave him the winning prize, They couldn't stand Napoleon being keyed. So maybe I'll do I have the excerpts from Saint Just? I don't remember if I saved that. I'm sorry. I thought it was kind of funny. Anyway, he has his own little Platonic republic, and they're all vegetarians, and they're all communist and poor. It's a very sad picture. I don't know. What other polemics are there? Oh, the Napoleon polemic. Should I continue on the Napoleon polemic? Napoleon is an interesting picture as to the left-right dichotomy of the time. Again, as I said, all the keyed men, all the interesting men. Basically, I would say you have those who align themselves. I mean, obviously, those who align themselves with the crown and those who wanted a republic all along. But these two essentially condensed into one camp after, obviously with Thermidor eventually. But you do see this national revolutionary type throughout, whether they supported the crown or not. Chamfort and Carnot hated the monarchy itself. Mirabeau and Sieyès didn't really care. They are essentially of a similar spirit. They are essentially of a national and bourgeois character, and we can hail them for that. But anyway, what was I going on about? We hail them. We don't hail the men of the left because they believe in Negroes and they believe in communism. But anyway, the thing with Napoleon is the coup of Fructidor is a good example of how this sort of thing can split ad infinitum, and the sort of non-necessity of the political divisions of the time, in my humble opinion, the sort of wastefulness of the revolution. A great young man of the stamp of Napoleon had to aid in a coup to depose a good, solid man like Carnot and his fellow, and the whole of the moderates from the French government in favor of incompetent libtards plus Talleyrand as an appanage in Fructidor. Very sad. You see this sort of arbitrary, stupid ideological division because the defense of the republic is the primary goal of the army. There's some threat of allegedly of a monarchist overthrow. Carnot gets wrongly lumped in with that. I mean, comically of all people, you would put Carnot with the monarchists. And so completely unnecessarily, completely wastefully, he's cast out of the country. The very man who recognized Napoleon's talent and saw his promotion through and saw his plans for the Italian campaign, probably the most disproportionately undervalued man of the entire French Revolution, Lazare Carnot. And he gets cast out of anyone in the coup of Fructidor. And I think there's an interesting parallel there with the libtard government of our time, because it's sort of a weird fusion between the right and the left. You have this vague libtard government pandering to the Jacobins in Paris, but of course not doing anything for the lower classes, really, just giving them the gibs and leaving it at that. Unnecessary operations in foreign wars, wasteful foreign wars, plundering of their neighbors with no long-term plan for long-term occupation, a divisive, incompetent, corrupt, libtard government, essentially. You have the horrible bribes, the horrible corruption, the shifting of public funds to private ends, the enrichment of this retarded, corrupt bureaucracy. That would be the second phase of the directory. You have that, I think, as an interesting example of the sort of directionless political moderation, this neither right nor left, incompetent libtard world. Obviously not equivalent to our own, but it is interesting that you see that there, that it's not that the market was either free or controlled. It's that there was simply no order and no scheme and no competence in government at all generally. And of course, it took the military to restore order. It took the military to put a common stamp on the nation again. And as I said, with Napoleon, the funny thing is, Napoleon was economically an enlightened centrist. Even politically, you could say, an enlightened centrist. And yet the economy completely reverses under the man. Without, again, it's not a spectrum of right or left, of government control or lack of control or anything of the sort. It's simply a competent man in control, appointing rightfully and enforcing with the entire force of the army behind him. It's simply the presence or lack of public order and the presence or lack of competence in this single guiding man that is infinitely more important than governmental schemes and economic plans, than all the retarded garbage that he himself attributed to the philosophes. The idea that you could write out on paper some stupid scheme and suddenly, the behavior of men would change without a drastic, without the change in human competence, without a respect for human desires, for the desire for property and perpetuity, for respect for the guaranteeing force of the army, which was constantly being undercut and abused by that libtard regime. So, anyway, Napoleon polemic. That one guy, which Back retweets a lot, has been posting translations of Napoleon. Obviously, he maintained throughout that he was an attempt to fuse the revolution with a fusion of the old with the new systems, the triumph of the modern system by accommodating itself to the old. Now, we don't necessarily hail that. I don't think we have to hail that. But I do think it's very telling, the sort of polemical evolution of Napoleon Bonaparte, which I would like to cover. I don't want to get too far into that because I haven't read his full biography or anything. But what's interesting about him, of course, is his entering as a Jacobin, arguably. And this, again, would feed into the polemic of, I think, Carnot is a purely military man, and as the military as the ennobling force of the revolution, of national struggle as the single ennobling force. He entered as a Jacobin, but his reasoning was, of course, the unity that was necessary to repel foreign invasion, the centralization, the uncompromising ruthlessness that was necessary to repel foreign invaders. If you can say anything about the Mountain, it is that they were competent. The ambassadors on mission, or whatever they were called, the fellows they sent out to fix the provinces, they were certainly much more effective than their enemies at administration, at infrastructure, at even at reforming the military and of levying hundreds of thousands of men. They were far more confident than their adversaries. And so simply from that argument of competence and of the argument of national defense, he placed himself with the Jacobins. He wrote that pamphlet, The Supper at Beaucaire, which is, of course, a hypothetical conversation with a few merchants where he lays out his arguments in favor of national defense and order. That got him favor from Augustin Robespierre and a promotion following. Brief suspicion after the Thermidorian reaction. And what's interesting about that booklet is as soon as he got the consulship, he, at great personal expense, bought and destroyed every single copy of it that he could. According to his biographer and friend Bourrienne, he bought and destroyed every copy of it. Very interesting. So, and when he was in Paris with his friend Bourrienne prior to the revolution, he witnessed the storming of the Tuileries twice, the two different occasions. First with the king donning the red hat, and then secondly, of course, him having to flee. And I think do I have the quotes? From Bourrienne. Good grief, maybe I don't. I don't know. Did I pull that up? I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't. Anyway, he mocked the king relentlessly. It was weakness, he said, alone that was unforgivable, as in that keyed Nietzschean, Thrasymachiean essay he wrote. What was unforgivable about King Louis was that he was weak, that he allowed those dirty proles to put a cap on his head. He later wrote that they are not even workers. They are just, it was just a gang of lumpenprole scum. It wasn't really a representative of the representatives of the Parisian population as a whole. He had a certain class disdain all throughout his life, which is keyed. And I posted that quote a while back from his observation of the dead Swiss guard in the garden, and how that he said in his memoirs that had more effect on him than any of the battlefields of his later career. The effect of the dead Swiss guardsmen in the gardens who were cut down ruthlessly. And I will say, when I was watching the French documentary movie thing of the French Revolution from whenever that was, it's just called the French Revolution. What a relief it was, I tell you, what a relief it was to hear a single word of German, to hear Halt, damn it, dear Halt or Foya or whatever, to see these sturdy Swabians, these sturdy blonde Swabians, uh, true, loyal unto death. It was a very refreshing experience. You see this connivance, you see this treason, you see this weakness, and suffusing the entirety of French society. And here you have these noble Swiss ready to die, at least for something, you know. And that is the source of the Sky Without Light quote. That is the song of the Swiss Guard. We hail the Swiss Guard. Napoleon hailed the Swiss Guard, and he was horrified by their death. So, wholesome libtard Napoleon, it's not true. It doesn't exist. When he came to power, of course, it was the Marseillaise troops who carried out that attack, who led it. It was them and some Bretons who led the attack on the National Guard. And of course, that was the source of the name of the Marseillaise. It was the band of proles that was sent from Marseille that had taken an oath not to return till they had deposed the king or something. And that's the source of the name of the French national anthem, which Napoleon hated, which he removed as the national anthem, and which he forbade to be played in his presence, even though its lyrics are very similar to Le Chant du Départ, however you say that. It's very similar lyrics, but he hated it simply from memory, simply from the associations with that band of proles. He forbade it, as I said, to be played in his presence. That's very keyed. He, of course, the entire premise of the Brumaire coup was that Jacobins were going to overthrow the government. When Marat yelled to his troops, get this damned rabble out of here, they answered, out with the Jacobins. Durant gives very keyed quotations. The soldiers yell their little chant in French, and one of the phrases is out with the Jacobins as they drive them with the point of their bayonets. So it really can't get more explicit than this. I don't think you can get more explicit. When he was almost blown up by those royalist plotters with that cart that was loaded with explosives, and he blamed it on the Jacobins, even though Fouché kept telling him over and over again that it was the royalists, and he had all this evidence. But Napoleon just refused to listen to him and just blamed it on the Jacobins because he wanted to get rid of them. So this sort of wholesome Chungus uprising of the downtrodden young men thing, it's not really true. The only force for nobility, in my humble opinion, are those national fellows, the moderate to right, whatever you would call a man like Carnot, a technocrat, a pragmatic-minded man, a Republican, but a propertied man, a man believing in social distinction, a man like Sieyès, who had no problem compromising with the crown, a man like Mirabeau, who was firmly attached to it. All these men had their own reasons. They didn't believe in retarded superstitions to justify their ideas. They each saw it as a means to their own end, to the end of the propertied classes and to French national interests. And they had no compunctions about using the king for that purpose, in the case of all of those fellows but Carnot. So, and then even the Girondists. I like to think of the Girondists as cringe. Obviously, Brissot was cringe. He founded that society, the Amis de Noir or whatever, for freeing the wholesome Negroes in the Caribbean. He founded that society. You look at his portrait; it's not a very good-looking portrait. Brissot, I don't like Brissot. He's a libtard. But you hear about these other Girondins. You hear about the way they met their death. You hear about, imagine the open fields of Provence and dozens of men. I don't know how many there were, probably just two at a time or whatever. Anyway, plunging swords into their breast because the Civil War had turned against them. That's keyed. I hail that. That's very cool. I think Spengler was proved right in the end. Left and right will reassert themselves under all circumstances. You can frame ideological schemes. You can make it about the king or not if you like, but all that will in the end be irrelevant. It's instinct that reasserts itself here. The desire for distinction, the belief in social distinction, the tolerance for superstition among the masses as a means of control, all these sorts of things. They will always reveal themselves again and again, however you try to divide the political compass, whatever incidental and retarded divisions force themselves. As I said, with Fructidor Napoleon siding with the libtards because obviously it was in his interest to do so. It was in his military interest to do so, to preserve the Republic. What's unfortunate from the whole thing is the absence of that guiding hand, the simple absence of the overriding personality to give form to chaos, all the wasted potential, all the wasted blood. It's horrifying. What I said earlier about how the Frankish aristocracy simply died of infertility. The same thing, in a sense, applied to the entire French nation after the Revolution and after the Napoleonic Wars. Relative to Germany, especially. Germany was about the same population as France. But then in the 20th century, it's 50% larger. France just completely stagnated. It seems as though the blood was spent. That who knows what process that involves? Who knows why that happens? That history seems to vampirize populations. Maybe it is some force of dysgenics. That's certainly one aspect. But whatever it is, it was spent. It was exhausted. It was used up. There was no guiding hand until the time of Napoleon. And of course, the entire world conspired to destroy him. So it all ended in ruin. Very sad. Very sad. And we hail the bourgeoisie when it climbs upwards. We hail the upper bourgeoisie. They were competent. Even Spengler hailed even gave a slight hail to Saint-Just in Prussianism and socialism. He gave even a slight hail. These people could muster armies out of nothing. They could repel foreign invaders outnumbered horribly. They couldn't win battles outnumbered horribly because they were horribly trained at that point. But still, they could create armies out of nothing. And that is of itself a point in their favor. That is a virtue that cannot be denied. And seeing this, one cannot help but mourn at the horrible waste of it all, that it wasn't put to a higher long-term end, that the governing aristocracy simply withered away, and there was nothing to replace it until the Corsican noblemen, the Corsican Renaissance noblemen, who finally gave a good form to it all. So, at any rate, that's all I have to say. I'm just giving random polemics. I apologize. I really need to. I just saw something keyed. Anyway, I need to read that all very thoroughly. I need to give a structure to this, a form that would probably take months, to be honest, to analyze the French Revolution in full, to get accurate statistics. That's the most infuriating thing. Some scholars say 150,000 noblemen. Some say 400,000. Maybe you don't care about that very much, but I kind of do. And, there's so little scholarship on the military revolution that occurred early on. Obviously, with Napoleon, you have very good scholarship on that. But the reforms that Carnot implemented, the use of the column, what effects that might have had, there isn't much scholarship on this, relatively speaking. I mean, like the Battle of Fleurus, you look that up on Google Images, and it's just like some MS Paint garbage. There's no like West Point Atlas for that stuff. There should be. So if I wanted to go in depth, I'm apologize for being disorganized, but maybe in the future, the distant future, if I get things more in order, I'll give you a hotter take. But the point of the ABC, let me say, the point of the ABC is that I learn. Okay, I'm learning, and I'm telling you what I learn, and you're learning with me, and I'm bringing you along. And isn't that great? But the problem is, of course, I don't yet know enough to impose form on this heap of evidence, this heap of statistics and whatnot that I have. I don't really have an all-encompassing view here, so I apologize for that. But if any of my best friends in the audience want to tell me their view, hey, I would accept that.